tell me about your work and why it interests you.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm assistant professor here at the University of Georgia, and I direct the developmental dynamics lab. And so we study a number of different types of kinds of developmental phenomena, from language development to sensory motor developments. How infants and children start learning to regulate their emotions in stressful situations. But at the core of our lab, we really kind of think deeply about the time scales of behavior, and conceptually and also quantitatively, we think about timescales of behavior and how we measure how behaviors unfold over time. A lot of the studies we do are, if we think about this spectrum of experimental control versus ecological validity, we're kind of more on that side of we still have experimental control in a lot of our studies, but they're more naturalistic, free flowing. We collect a lot of different types of data within like an interaction between an infant and their caregiver, or a child and their caregiver. And so we really try to curate these multimodal, multivariate time series of like heart rate data, hemodynamic responses from the brain, and microcoding of behaviors in real time, and kind of putting it all together to ask questions about these types of developmental phenomena that I talked about. So we span a lot of different areas of developmental psychology in the lab, and also some emerging areas. So we have a sleep study with infants right now. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just a fun, like, why am I a developmental psychologist? I just think it's an incredibly interesting area of science where, we're thinking about, AI is a huge thing right now, right? Well, if you want to think about building an artificial learning system, we ought to know a lot about the biological systems as well, and really how those develop, right? And so there's actually some, I think, important connections between developmental science and artificial intelligence. And so, yeah, there's just all these really fun questions. If you're a psychologist, you're, usually looking at how behavior changes over time. A developmental psychologist, you see changes much faster a lot of times. These infants are developing rapidly, and it's just an exciting period of development to be focused on.
It's helpful that you situate developmental psychology there in both psychology, but then also like, yeah, issues now like AI and learning. It's fascinating that you kind of inherently get this issue, child development, that has lots of learning, right? So it's it's kind of, the whole point is that things are changing rapidly. You talked about like measuring different things over time. What would be an example of a study you've done? Like, what kind of questions are you in your lab answering?
Sure. Yeah. So, over measuring things over time, to make the point a little clear, like, what is time? Is it like a 10-minute interaction, or is it a
Mm.
longitudinal study over months or years, right? So one example of measuring things over time is we have a lab that we have a study in our lab that we just finished, data collection. It was the first study in my lab, and COVID made it a lot longer in terms of bringing in families. And the primary open questions were like, how did children learn to regulate their emotions in these stressful situations? And we can like experimentally, we can like parameterize how stressful these tasks are for children. And we bring them in with their caregiver, in this case, their biological mother, and we put them in like a stressful task. And basically, it's like a Lego building task, and we make it hard and stressful in different ways. And we track, audio, video. So we have like a lot of, video cameras in the lab. So we have audio, video, so we can get body movement data and also linguistic transcriptions of the interaction of them trying to build this Lego tower. We track their heart physiology using wireless ECG and that's like synchronized with the video. But we also track their hemodynamic responses using an Abney system, which is basically, if you have an Apple Watch or any sort of watch, there's infrared light going in. You can track hemodynamic responses in various ways, and we do that with the child and their biological mother as well. So we have this, we're tracking all these, I'm calling them modalities, but they're really just tapping into different systems of an individual, but also of the dyad. And so we can look at this at a number of different levels of analysis, how the individual responds to the stressful situation, but also how the dyad as a system responds to the stressful situation. And from there, we can ask a lot of different questions, kind of at a systems level, about emotion regulation.
Yeah, it's interesting you say there that you're learning not just about the child, but also that the parent child interaction. Um, I mean, how, maybe just not getting deep into the developmental psychology, but more as just an interesting question. Is it difficult to do these studies? You kind of said with COVID, you're having to track loads of different things, and you also mentioned the problem of like experimental sort of validity. Like you have this kind of environment, and you're making people build things. How are you? You're getting lots of data in these experiments. What are you then doing with it, and how? What is the setup like as you do these kinds of experiments?
Sure. Yeah. So it's COVID didn't help anything really. The bringing families into the lab was the main constraint given COVID. Like we started this in early 2021, and so that's aside. That's just difficult. That was difficult. We're kind
Mm-hmm.
of over that hurdle. But in terms of collecting this kind of system of data, it is really hard, and we take it seriously. Like the systems that we kind of put all together and synchronize. Each one of those components. We have to have its own protocol for coding protocol for coding from the video, like affective behaviors. So we have a team of undergraduate researchers who that's what they do. They code every time the child or their parent produce like a negative or positive affective behavior. That's like their own separate team, right? And then we have people who are like specialized in coding the data from the ECG system, because those data aren't clean just when you press record and then you get this column vector of data. Like it's not clean. You have to process it, and there's a protocol there, and we assess reliability of coders. And then same with the FNIR system for collecting hemodynamic responses. We have a team, we have another team that specializes in that. And so it's difficult, but I think that's the exciting part of it, is like it's a very unique data set that we're kind of building. So yeah, I mean, we have been working on processing the data and coding the data and like getting a certain level of reliability across our teams before we even consider like publishing anything, right? We have these research questions, and we'll pre-register the analyses for them. But this is definitely one of those studies where we've collected the data first, and then, in terms of an open science perspective, where we will be at is pre-registering analyses and then working on the studies, working on the analyses from there.
Mm.
And so there's, you ask about the questions we can ask. I'll just like name, we have different graduate students in the lab who have different interests, and they're like, I'm going to focus on that. And then, so I'll just like name a couple that are really, I think, interesting. So we actually don't know a lot about how so the physiological system, we have a pretty good understanding about how different physiological signals in children and their caregivers respond kind of at a longer time scale when a stressful situation happens. And we can go more into that, but like we just know physiology changes in particular ways when a stressful event happens. Um, we actually don't know a lot about how, like in a natural interaction, usually children and their parents are talking, they're using their language to communicate different things about the stressful situation. We actually don't know really a lot about the relationship between language and physiology during these stressful situations. And so we have a graduate student in the lab, Christian Jerry, who has his own undergraduate research team, who spent a semester linguistically transcribing these dyadic interactions, and he's starting to put together some hypotheses about how the language they produce might be impacting their physiology when a stressful event happens. Another example, bringing in the brain imaging side of it. Similarly, we don't know really how in a more naturalistic interaction, which these are kind of more naturalistic interactions compared to other previous studies, how different areas of prefrontal cortex respond during the stressful situation, but also how they respond when somebody's producing an utterance. Like, so bringing back that language component, producing not just an utterance, but how they, what happens in the prefrontal cortex when they're producing an utterance that has like a lot of negative affect in it. Like when a child is like at a point where they're really frustrated with a task, how does the prefrontal cortex, the activity there change during those types of utterances versus other types of utterances? So these are just like, a couple of examples, at also a couple different timescales of the interaction, thinking about timescales of seconds to timescales of minutes at this point.
It's interesting that am I right in saying that when you say physiologically, you can kind of see and understand, like, say, the link between a baby and a caregiver? Like, would that be like things like heart rate, like or you might be able to measure things like this, but you're saying that things like language or things going on in the brain, is that a little harder to study, and there's these little areas that we don't really know the importance and the role of these things as a child develops, and especially the link between like the caregiver and the child?
Yeah, to a point. I think that in the past 5 years, there's been a lot of progress, and actually some labs in the UK have done some really amazing work, um, uh, and starting to understand the dynamics of physiology and behavior within developmental populations. The technology has improved where we can better capture data at a finer time scale, and so I would say that we're, within the past 5 years, we've seen a number of labs do excellent work, really targeting the relationships between physiology and behavior in more naturalistic settings. And so, I'm describing what we're doing in my lab. There's definitely other labs, who I think hopefully we're all inspiring each other to do this cool work. They definitely, there's labs in the UK, for example, that have inspired some of the work we're doing as well. But there's not like that many of us who are doing this at this point.
Tell me a bit about the experiment with the Lego and emotions. What did you learn in that situation?
Yeah. So that study is like the one I kind of explained, where we're still kind of we're actually pretty much done
Mm.
with processing of the data, and so we're this is the end of the fall semester here. I would say at the beginning of the spring semester, at the beginning of January, is when we're really going to start, working on, the graduate students in my lab kind of working on, you know, pre-registering their analyses for the kind of the study they want to really work on with those data. What I can say in terms of, like, everybody has their interests in that study. My main interest, kind of the paper that I'm going to work on as kind of the leader of the project, and is really this idea. So we talked about physiology and emotion regulation. Um, a lot of developmental psychologists have looked at emotion regulation and the development of motion regulation, by how infant or a child and their caregiver co-regulate in different ways. So, and what that means is, like, in a stressful situation, do their behaviors synchronize, or are they happening kind of in a very small period of time together? There's been researchers who have focused on, we'll call that behavioral synchrony, and how that explains variability in emotion regulation. Um, and in the past 10 years, there's actually been researchers who have gone a step further and looked at physiological synchrony. So, how does the co regulation happen in the physiological systems? Primarily looking at heart rate, but some other signals as well. And then more recently, people have published these studies looking at how activity in prefrontal cortex might synchronize in these stressful situations, and how that relates to, you know, motion regulation, other types of kind of clinical outcomes that people are interested in. So I'm building this up piecemeal, right? There's like these people focusing on behavior, physiology, hemodynamic responses with prefrontal cortex. What I'm really interested in is, like, okay, that those are all coming from the same system or set or dyadic system. Um, so we should probably put that all together and better understand the unique variability explained or not by behavior, heart physiology and areas of the brain. And so what I'm really interested in is building kind of like a network approach to understanding the multimodal dietic system. So putting all of those signals into a network type of model and looking at how that network changes kind of before, during, and after a stressful situation. So that's what that's what I'm excited about in terms of this project. I think it's kind of a more pluralistic way of thinking of the phenomenon that we're studying here, in terms of the kind of like looking at it at a lot of different multiple levels of analysis and putting it all together.
So, am I right in saying that you are looking at the many different parts, in a kind of like a variable order regression, like you're kind of having them all, seeing how everything links together, and so what, like, maybe not in this study, but have you tried to do that with other things? Are you what have you found? Sort of, you mentioned timescales. What have you found in terms of how say behavior and functioning in the brain, how are they related? Are they just separable, or how would they interact?
Yeah, well, so I'll kind of answer that in two ways. In terms of the brain and the behavior interacting, I think there's a lot of you know decades of work focusing on that, on the behavior, brain and behavior relationships. But I think the focus maybe that I'm interested in is like the timescales of those relationships, and really taking seriously these like finer timescale relationships. And so the study that I just talked about is kind of the first one in my research program. So that's like, I can't really talk more about that at this point. But what I
Hmm.
can talk about is kind of thinking about timescale of behavior and interaction between people. And so uh, the, the work that I did in grad school focused on models of multiscale coordination, and specifically this idea called complexity matching that was first kind of brought to the in a publication in the complexity science complex networks literature, and there that was just with adults, so adult dyads, and we put these undergraduate students into a room and we had them talk about different topics. And we figured out, these some topics were like fun topics, like talk about your favorite movie, right? And then we figured out what they kind of disagree with, like in terms of we give them some surveys, and maybe one person's for marijuana legalization and the other one's against it. This was in California, so everybody was for it. That's a bad example, but let's just use that as an example. And that would be kind of the argumentative conversation that we had them do, right? And what we did was we tracked their body movements, just gross body movements, how their movement, like at the full body level. But we also tracked kind of the low level acoustic energy of their vocalizations. And what we were able to show is that during these two different conversational contexts, not just their synchrony differed. So like, did they move together at the same time, right? But at multiple timescales, there was convergence of their behaviors. And so if you think about a multi-scale analysis where they're like, we can look at the temporal covariation instantaneously. So if you move to the left and I move to the left at the same time, that would be that time scale, right? But we can think about, these conversations unfold over multiple time scales. And so we can actually do these analyses to show that at a number of different time scales, going up to about like 5 or 6 minutes, there's actually this convergence of movement behaviors and also speech acoustic behaviors. And so that was kind of like the first study where we were like, whoa, we can actually understand, we can actually like parse, whether or not a dyad was in, an argumentative conversation or what we called an affiliative conversation, this happy conversation, just by like, for example, looking at the speech, like the speech acoustics and the multiscale properties and convergence of the speech acoustics. That was kind of the first study that really got me thinking about looking at multimodal human interaction. And then from there, I started thinking more about development. And so I still study multimodal human interaction, but just with different populations, specifically, infants and children.
Right. So that's very interesting with the language. So, like, in what ways is it, say, an argument versus a more happy conversation? In what ways are they different? You said that you could measure it instantaneously. Someone's like moving. Are there patterns to it? How could you differentiate those?
Yeah. So the analyses we did were, this is like a reviewer question on one of these papers. These analyses are kind of like agnostic to the specific patterns of movements or clusters of speech that happen, because the speech themselves, the speech behavior, you think about these different signals and the kind of the temporal structure of them. A lot of these signals and naturalistic interactions aren't like these fluctuations where they happen every 2 seconds or 5 seconds like a metronome. They're actually like kind of clustered in time, and people call that bursty behavior, or bursty temporal structure. But that's the type of temporal structure we observe. That's not as important in terms of like, I think your question of like the contents of the patterns, like are they gesture, like we're not really picking up on like a deictic gesture, for example,
Hmm.
like some sort of like symbolic gesture. Like we're not picking up on that. We're kind of picking up more on the spatio-temporal dynamics of these interactions that are more agnostic to like contentful patterns that we can describe. Does that make sense?
That does. So when you say like then like a bursty behavior, what I mean, what do you mean there is like the two what there are more sequences where you have a span of a lot of conversation and then like gaps. Like how then if you're not measuring exactly what people are doing, but you're measuring sort of the amount of different things, so then how would you distinguish between say and an argument versus a less argumentative conversation?
Yeah. So from there, there's been some kind of simple computations to get at like what's the temporal structure of a signal, right? And so we could just have a signal that's movement data or speech data or something else, and use these kind of like algorithms to kind of compute like what the temporal structure is, whether or not it's like random. Are things unfolding randomly over time? Whether they're periodic, so are they more kind of like a metronome? And there's signals that are like that, right? Like our heartbeat is kind of like a metronome. There's a little bit of what we'd consider like healthy variability there. And then on the other side of that spectrum is kind of this clustered behavior. And if you look at a lot of natural data, and there's like this is kind of in the field of statistical physics, there's like a lot of these really great descriptive studies showing that a lot of humanly produced phenomena, but also natural phenomena like earthquakes, lightning strikes. You know, you talk to Damien, so like Damien Kelsey Stevens, so like he would show that there's like these fractal properties of these like these statistical fractals of these phenomena. But there are a lot of these. If you think about this from the bursty periodic spectrum, a lot of them are kind of bursty, and so there's kind of like this ubiquitous, not 100% ubiquitous, but like you see a lot more of these behaviors or signals being bursty, and so there's like this kind of it's not a universality, but like there's just an overwhelming amount of these signals that would be considered bursty or clustered, and then the question is like, does that matter at all? Like, like, is this like epiphenomenal, or like, do we take that seriously? And as a developmental psychologist, the National Science Foundation just funded one of our projects to take that seriously. Specifically, like if an infant is learning and developing in a world that has the statistical structure, what does that mean for their word learning, right? Like if they're in this multimodal world that has this statistical structure, well, does the language environment also include that type of statistical structure? Now, does that matter for when they learn how to map a word reference to an object in their environments? And so that's a project we're working on right now, that really takes seriously this notion of like understanding the temporal structure of behavior.
So when you say that you can kind of like you see this bursty behavior and you're like, does it matter, or is it kind of I mean, it makes sense to me that I suppose in a conversation like it wouldn't be kind of, monotone, and there would be periods when you express meaning and things. And so I know you saying that, like, well, what did you find then? Were like, would that predict like understanding how, like, what would that predict in conversations when you'd like find more of this behavior?
Yeah, so there's a study that was published a year ago, and I was not first author. My colleague and friend Lauren Sloan was, and I laugh because like I wasn't first author in this paper, but it's like my favorite paper I've ever been a part of, like for real. And in that study, it was a word learning study with infants and their caregivers. They were in this kind of tabletop play, and the caregivers, there was like these kind of like novel objects that we made in 3D printers, and there was like artificial words that were associated with those. So like here's the bibu, here's the bata, I don't know, and the parents had the pictures. They had a picture like where the infant can see with like the words attached to them, and they were just instructed like, hey, play with these toys, and whenever you want, like produce the reference to that toy whenever you want, right? So kind of a natural, semi-naturalistic tabletop experimental setup, right? And they played for 5 minutes. We tracked behaviors, we tracked their vocalizations, and then at the end of the 5 minute interaction, there was this word learning task where we, in a particular way, were able to assess whether or not the infant could map that reference to that novel object, and so we could get like kind of a word learning performance score from there. So what we did then was we kind of fed the parent vocalization data into that algorithm that I was explaining before. It's really actually more of an equation to get a sense of when that parent talked about that particular object, what was the temporal structure of their vocalizations. So the findings there were, first of all, there is an interesting distribution of temporal structure of these vocalizations. Like there were some that were periodic, like categorized as periodic, and then overwhelming, like maybe 70% of the vocalizations were categorized as clustered or bursty, and then we could assess whether or not that temporal structure predicted what like their performance in the word learning assessment. And what we found was that the vocalizations that were clustered or bursty, those associated with objects that were learned at higher rates. And so this was a good example that the temporal structure of parental speech actually did matter for word learning, taking it back to that idea of like, hey, infants are developing and learning in this particular type of multimodal statistical structure of this environment, like that taking it to that point, like that kind of does matter for this like kind of more simplistic word learning experiment. So that was a really cool study and paper, and really inspires the work we're doing now.
Yeah, it's interesting because if an economist, say, is wanting to like learn about, okay, how do children learn things, they might only care about the amount of time a adult spends with a child. But then you might be saying, well, no, actually it matters how they interact, it matters the kinds of interaction they have. And so there's certain speech patterns and certain ways of, say, talking with an object, if I get this right, that would actually help, say, a child learn the names of that object. And so I mean, this interesting pattern of the longer, the sort of, in a 5 minute time scale, how speech is clustered, that matters. Is that finding that you're seeing like beyond language? I mean, what is the importance of that kind of finding?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you make. Like a lot of people studying developmental language developments, for many decades, and rightfully so, it explains a lot of variability. The quantity and quality of language matters, in terms of the language environment for an infant learning a language, right? But what we're focusing on here is not just quantity, quality, which is kind of an aggregate measure of like the day or an experimental session, but how these behaviors unfold over time, and that's like kind of the innovation here, right? Now, your question about like how, maybe kind of scaling this to not just language, right? Um, you, you know, we don't, this is not published, and maybe someday it will be published. We've been working on it for years, and you set these studies down and like you get distracted after teach this class, whatever. But we have a study where we have I think like hundreds of hours of baby headcam data, where we basically, I say we, but there's other colleagues who collected these data, where these babies had these cameras kind of on their forehead, and their data was collected kind of throughout an entire day, and now you have basically egocentric images from the baby's point of view. Um, the same, same sort of question: what's the temporal structure of things coming in and out of the egocentric view of a developing human being? And of course, like the talk about the ubiquitous of this temporal structure. We see a lot more of these egocentric signals being bursty, like things coming in and out of view are not happening like every 5 minutes. They're coming in and out of view rapidly, and then they go out of view for hours, and then they come back in and out of view, right? And when I say things, I mean like faces in view, bodies in view, hands in view. So scaling this idea from like language and within that example of that paper I talked about, to like a time scale of the day, and understanding the visual ecology of a human infant, we're also seeing these types of these patterns. And I'll just add the like bringing it back to the artificial intelligence thing that we started at the beginning, right? Like if you're creating an artificial learning system, you have training data, and if you're training like an algorithm, you have a data set or a set of data sets that are your training data that you kind of feed through the system, and it learns, right? So think about like the egocentric perspective of an infant, of the developing learning system there, and like now we think about like the temporal structure of just their visual environment, right? If I was building an artificial learning system, I might want to start thinking about the temporal structure of that learning data, the sequences of those learning data, and people do think about it that way, but like trying to make this connection between developmental science and developmental learning systems and these artificial learning systems. I think there's a lot of connections to be made there.
It's yeah, and like to help me understand this, like a related thing, I think paper from yours is that with language and learning it, you might talk about certain things like a specific time in the day, and you talk about it a lot, but then later on, and maybe you don't talk about that for the rest of the day, right? You get these like bursts of you really learn about it a lot, and as you say, in a way that could maybe be applied to things like AI, right? How they're not learning it in a kind of linear way where they have this similar exposure to the same things. Actually, no, they does this also have any implications for how someone might like a student like learning like in terms of exposure to material? I mean, does that any relevance?
I think so. I'm like I see those connections, right? Because in that literature that you're bringing up, they there's a couple of ideas that come up a lot in terms of experimental design for like bringing this to like adult learning, in education, and that's how we space or block learning phases and test phases, and you can parameterize like how many learning phases there are, how many test phases there are, and people can do that type of research, and it's been a really fruitful, impactful field of research, kind of combining psychology and education. And so I totally see the connections with that work and what I'm talking about here in terms of really taking seriously the temporal structure of how things are unfolding over time, because what they're doing in those studies is literally parameterizing the temporal structure of test retest, right? And I think there's connections to be made there, and there have been conversations about that. We have a colleague of mine, Lauren Sloan, who was the first author on that paper I talked about, with the word learning experiments. We've developed a study that it's like a pre-registered study. So we're waiting for reviewers to like give us feedback before we even start data collection. Where we kind of get further into this education question and parameterize the temporal structure of adult learning of categories. So like we're definitely, there's definitely connections there that people see, and we're doing it slowly.
Hmm. It's when you talk about these kinds of interesting new findings about being more nuanced about how people say learn things. It's kind of maybe overturning or at least showing new possibilities in developmental psychology, things we might have missed before. Are there any other things in the field that or that people miss, or things that someone looking in from the field from the outside they get wrong about developmental psychology?
That's a good question. That I have to really be introspective about
Okay, okay.
about that. Let's see. It kind of goes back to I'm trying to make these connections in my own work to artificial intelligence and
Mm.
artificial learning systems. I think is a better way to think about it in terms of the connections with developmental science. Um, Going to answer this question is like, what's trendy right now? And trendy right now is AI, right? ChatGPT and these LLMs and stuff like that. And I think when people take seriously in our field what a learning system is, it's definitely a lot closer to when like kind of what people people not in the field would think of as AI, right? And I think that the more we take that seriously as researchers, I think the more impact we'll have, not just in our fields, but in terms of impact with the public, how, better understanding what developmental psychology and developmental science can really bring to and the theories of developmental psychology can bring to scaling up and thinking about AI
Mm.
and artificial learning systems. Um, I think to try to answer your question more, it's like what does my mom ask about my research? And whenever
Mm.
I tell her about my research, and she's awesome, she like tries to understand she asks these really deep questions, but she always tries to relate it to like, well, how would that relate to somebody with this particular developmental disability? And it's a perfectly fair question, and I asked it, and I have colleagues who are working on those developmental applied questions, like clinical questions, right? And that's where I get a lot of questions from family members about those like applied clinical things, right? But as a basic researcher in developmental psychology, I think more of like the connections with AI,
Mm.
it'd be great if that would be better communicated, and that's also a science communication question. That's something that you're doing a great job of, is hosting a cool podcast. So
Oh, thank you. No, I really like you bringing up AI. We've talked about it, but it's funny because obviously we've had AI for some time, but when it's grown recently, we are really thinking about like we don't just, and this is was probably a conception where we program them, right, and then there we have them. But no, they're now we kind of realize they're kind of self-evolving, self-changing, and to be as good as they can be, we can't just program them. They're going to have to learn. And so the link to how babies, how we learn ourselves is really important there. I actually had a conversation with this biologist who was kind of a computer scientist at first, and looking at uh, the differences between biology and the way neurons and neural networks are set up in our brain versus how we do them, and like suddenly the way we create, say, machine learning networks, they're much simpler. They have weights, things, these mathematical numbers, which is certainly not how neurons work. And so I would say then, just it is very kind of interesting to think about how this is actually all going on in a actual developing human being, and then thinking about how that might be applied to AI.
definitely, and I'll just add like another thing there. You brought up this important point about biological plausibility, right? And that's like kind of the tension between these artificial learning systems and biological systems. One thing that I take seriously and I really think is important is kind of like what the base rates of human behavior are. So that should matter for a biological learning system or an artificial learning system. Like, this is the base rates of behavior. What I mean there is, like, we actually have these like decades of research studying motor developments, decades of studying language developments, and we're starting just now, I think, to start understanding, like, how like, really, how often does an infant reach for something in one day? How many steps does an infant take each day? Like, people have started asking those questions, but it's like just now where we have the sensor technology and the kind of the simple algorithms to classify behaviors, to actually ask those questions about the base rates of human behavior. I think that matters a lot, and there's such basic questions, especially in human development and developmental psychology. I think they're just like profoundly simple questions to ask, and we're like at a good point where we can actually answer them with sensor technology and things like that.
No, that's very interesting. I think about this kind of even just typically in my own life. How much do we actually measure? How much do we actually know about? It makes me think of like the history of science, right? Like even Freud going like, do we ever really think about even like what is a child's life like? We just sort of assume, they come fully formed here, and going, wait, no, like let's look at their experience, as you say now. Let's get really fine grained detail about kind of what they're doing, and that kind of makes me want to ask um, the question we sort of talked about in the preamble, but to what degree are things learned versus to what degree do we come into this world knowing things? Is that a meaningful question? How should we think about, I guess this would be a nature nurture kind of debate.
Yeah. And so I think the boring answer would just be to give you my opinion about it, or like my scientific perspective, right? I think the more interesting answer is acknowledging that there's like these different perspectives to study in studying learning and studying developmental psychology, where like on one side, there's people who their research programs are inspired more from kind of a kind of nativist type of perspective of you were born with these kind of core abilities, and then on the other side of the spectrum, kind of a pure learning, like you were born with very little capabilities and you're just kind of soaking in the statistical structure of the environments and you learn that way. And then there's people in between, right? Like, that's the acknowledgement of kind of that tension, but also that kind of spectrum where people have their research programs inspired wholly by where you are there. And I think that, and I have my own perspective, that inspires my research program. But I just think that there's questions like this one, the nature nurture debates, right? That is almost like a useful tool for scientific innovation. I think it by itself, just having those debates, and not just to be a contrarian, right? But like that really have those debates is really healthy for scientific discipline, because it allows us in good faith to make these create these hypothesis spaces where we can actually really get a better understanding about word learning, for example, if we have people from different scientific perspectives, arguing in good faith empirically, right? And so I think of the nature nurture debate as like a scientific tool almost for innovation. Of course, we can couch ourselves in where we are on that spectrum. But I think a more pluralistic point of view is a better one for scientific discipline. People would completely disagree with me on that in terms of epistemological pluralism. But that's kind of my perspective. Taking a step back and thinking about this nature nurture debate for as long as I have.
It's interesting that your perspective is about appreciating that there are many different viewpoints, and that we just studying the issue and trying to think, well, in this specific domain like language, how much do people come pre-programmed versus how much do people learn? And would you be able to speak, because you talked about it off the air, about whether this is an answerable question, sort of scientifically, like can we ever, will we ever settle this kind of issue?
Yeah, and perhaps that's like the most controversial thing that I think. No matter where I am on that spectrum, that's I think the more I think about the philosophy of science and like just being honest with the way the way we set up our research questions. I am not convinced it's an answerable problem. This nature nurture debate. Of course, it's a a non-zero probability that somebody will solve that. But like again, I just think that it's better used as a scientific tool for the way we think about these questions. And so yeah, I don't know. I don't think that would get me into too much trouble in scientific disciplines to say that. I don't know,
Mm.
I think it's just being honest. Like it might not be solvable, and that's okay. We will still using it as a scientific tool for discovery. We will still understand and explain developmental phenomena that will be useful for our society, even if we don't solve that problem.
Kind of relatedly, I was wondering if you have any knowledge or insight into how much parents influence their children. Like, how much would a child have grown to be the kind of person that they would have been anyway? How much do maybe even friends and family influence and change the growth direction of their children? I guess I come from this looking at some research that's saying, where children, they kind of become the adult they were going to be anyway based on like genetics. So I'm just wondering how much, and I guess this relates to the other question. I'm not saying we have to give a definitive answer, but I'm just wondering how much the parents influence their children.
Yeah. I mean, it's a mixture of both, right? It's a mixture of your experiences, but also there's these studies showing that genetics matter, right? In terms of outcomes, but where I think it's you know unfolded to is this idea, converged more is a better word, to this idea that it's a mixture of your genetics, but also a mixture of your environments, not just of your parents, but a lot of different factors that we would consider the environmental properties that kind of bring you towards that where you are at that point in development. And so yeah, it's definitely an interaction between
Mm.
those two kind of categories of factors.
I mean, it's how, how would you you looked at like small timescales of like a individual like interaction session. Uh, is there work done on like the ways in which to help more beneficially like raise a child, like in longer time scales, like how much interaction you're supposed to have, or like peer groups, like is there the research on like how best to help child development succeed?
Sure. Yeah. So, there's these kind of like take home messages that we have, from like, it definitely helps to, read to your child, talking, with quantity and quality, right? There's, and I think I'm kind of being silly because like those are just
Mm.
simple points to make. Um, but I think, you know, bringing this multi-scale part to it, that's kind of where we're at, I think, in terms of to really answer your question. We kind of need to have a multi-scale way of thinking of our science. And I think, kind of there. I think we're getting to that point where we can you actually think about the multi-scale properties of these behaviors. But I think it's still so new, in terms of, at least we think about with not just conceptually in developmental psychology, but also quantitatively. And so we're just not really, I think, at that point yet.
Mm.
And so that's definitely the focus of my research program and lab, is really trying to think less conceptually and more quantitatively about the multi-scale outcomes. And that will just take time, and so yeah, it was a good question.
Yeah, like points to your work and the people that you've been talking about, that you kind of actually need that differentiation and nuance in it. You said you looked at a bit of work and sleep. Would you be able to speak about what you've been learning about sleep?
Sure. Yeah, this is the newest area of my research lab, but there are developmental psychologists who are far more expert in infant sleep and that than I am, and so it's kind of fun to be kind of getting into a new area of research. And so I'm primarily focused on this one study. This was funded by the McConnell Foundation, and we're in the second of 4 years of the study right now, and what we're really interested in is sensory motor developments. Okay, just that topic. And what we usually think about sensory motor development, and what we usually inform our ideas about sensory motor development, is like when the infants are awake. Infants are really only awake like 6 hours of the day, and so okay, well, what about the other part of their day when they're sleeping, which is like up to 16 hours per day? And Well, infants actually move around quite a lot in our sleep, and this has been studied in non-human models, and it's just starting to get studied in human infants. And specifically, we're looking at particular types of movements called myoclonic twitches, where these are non-random movements, and you've probably seen like cat videos on YouTube where the cat's sleeping and they're like, they're twitching. Yeah, a lot of those would be considered myoclonic twitches. There's been some excellent neuroscience work showing that those twitches are, functionally important for mapping the sensory motor system in non-human models. And there's been a few published studies with human infant models looking kind of like trying to now move it into the human infant model realm. And so what we're doing in this study in my lab is this is actually a home-based sleep study where our research team goes to the home of infants at 4, 6, and 8 months of age. We track them during a nap, and we'll be basically behaviorally coding their twitches, which is kind of painstaking. So we'll track like twitches throughout their body through video. And then when they wake up, we put these pants on them, and we call them Sensi pants. Basically, they just have accelerometers. Accelerometers, you have them in your watch. And we track their body movements throughout the rest of the day. And a colleague of mine, John Franchak at UC Riverside, created pretty simple algorithms to classify body posture and movement from those accelerometers in the pants. And what we're going to try to do is really try to better understand like those movements during sleep, those myoclonic twitch dynamics that are non-random. They're spatiotemporally connected. Kind of meaning like if you see a twitch in the shoulder, you have a higher probability of seeing a twitch in their like lower parts of their limb effectors. So how the movement dynamics during sleep relate to their movement dynamics when they're awake? And kind of that's the basic kind of question. Is there a relationship at all? Is there a longitudinal relationship? So like if we know something at 4 months, will that predict, variability at 6 or 8 months, and so on? And so it's the first study, and for me, in our lab, we're just learning a lot about how to actually implement a sleep study, it's super fun. We get to work with cool sensor technology, these kind of rather pretty simple machine learning algorithms, it's just like when you think about science and being in this field, like it's just fun. It's just cool. It's fun. You're learning stuff, and so yeah, that's what we're doing with the sleep research right now, and I think it's definitely going to be a larger area of the research program in the lab going forward.
In this conversation, we've kind of talked a lot about like the future of the field and how we're using more, say, sensor technologies and things. But I mean, as a final question, what are in the long-term future? What kinds of questions and what kinds of research would you like, not just yourself, but would you like the field to be doing?
Yeah. So, a couple of points there. One direction that's already happening that I think is really important is the team science elements of the research. And this is, important for a number of reasons. One being kind of the reproducibility of science, and I think that's essential moving forward in how we think about the questions we ask, but also how we would implement our experiments across different labs. And there's a number of initiatives in developmental psychology that are doing that. So that's a kind of more a implementational point of the future of research. In terms of the content, for my lab particularly, like this and we're not the only ones who think about this. My postdoc advisor, Linda Smith, had like a talk that was titled this, It's All Connected. And I taking seriously that we shouldn't just be studying, I study a lot of different developmental phenomena because it's all, in my opinion, it's all connected in various ways, right? And that's why we like to study these different phenomena in social interactions, because that's kind of where a lot of these things play out, right? And so the future of my lab, what we're doing right now is trying to connect these different, what we consider siloed developmental phenomena, and put them into the same kind of multimodal, multiscale experience. So if I'm interested in motor developments, and I'm also interested in language developments, are there ways we can study those things in the same social interaction, because that's where they're playing out, and also across longer timescales. And so, the future of that, I think we're going to hopefully see more like studies where they're like day-long studies, multi-day studies, to better understand, again, like the base rates of human behavior. I think that's definitely an area that I would be excited for the field to be going into.
Awesome. Do you have any last words or anything you want to say, and where can people find your work?
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be on your podcast, and thanks for doing this podcast. It's so cool that you have this going on, and so thank you. And people can find my I guess my research lab as the devdynelab.us is the website. I'm on Twitter/X at Drew Abney, but I don't really post that much there anymore for various reasons. But again, thank you very much for the invitation and for the chat.